In this video, we're going to discuss a definition of conflict and then talk about some of the reasons why conflict happens within our relationships. It's important to note that a lot of what we're learning about today is true of not just intercultural relationships, but of all relationships that we're a part of. So this information is not only valuable to understanding your intercultural relationships, but technically any relationship that you're a part of. Conflict is the perceived or real incompatibility of goals, values, expectations, processes, or outcomes between two or more interdependent individuals or groups. So within that definition, it's important to remember that interdependent individuals or interdependent groups are groups of people or individuals who rely on one another to get things done. So remember that definition from early in the semester. We also want to remember that in order for conflict to happen, it doesn't actually have to be evident to both individuals who are in conflict or to both groups who are in conflict. So conflict simply has to be perceived by one of those individuals. So again, that means sometimes we might not recognize that within our relationships we're in conflict situations, but so long as one person perceives there to be a conflict, that conflict technically exists. Also, it's important to note that there are many reasons why conflict can come about. So as individuals, we all have different cultural backgrounds, and thus we likely have different values than the people that we interact with. Our values, as we've learned this semester, are tied to the social and political structures that help us understand how individuals in our culture ought to behave. So there's social and there's political rules concerning how people within a culture should interact with one another or how they should do things. So all conflict really needs to be understood within the context of the culture in which that conflict is happening or the culture in which the individuals in the conflict come from. So our gender, sexual, racial, ethnic, religious identities, just to name a few of the many different identities that we can have, are all going to affect the way that we look at conflict situations. So our cultural backgrounds then are intrinsically tied to the different conflicts that we experience. So we can't really understand a conflict without understanding the cultures of the individuals involved in that conflict. There are different types of conflict that you ought to be aware of. First, interpersonal conflict is conflict between two or more people who have some type of relationship with one another. So when individuals in an organization start fighting within their work group, that's considered interpersonal conflict. Political conflict is conflict that occurs on a societal level. So protests or conflicts that center on Obamacare are considered political conflicts. International conflict is conflict between different nations or different international groups. So the terrorist attacks on 9/11 would be considered international conflict. Even though technically Al-Qaeda isn't tied to a particular nation, it is important to remember that groups from overseas would also be considered international conflict rather than domestic conflict, which would be conflict that occurs within our country. So why does intercultural conflict happen? It's important to consider this question because if we want to maintain our intercultural relationships, we have to consider the fact that conflict is a part of life and is going to happen in any relationship that we're a part of. Thus, part of maintaining our relationships is understanding how we can resolve the conflicts that will inevitably happen. If we're going to resolve conflicts, however, we have to know why those conflicts are occurring. Sometimes intercultural conflict happens when people have feelings that are incompatible. So Lucy likes Schroeder, but Schroeder doesn't share the same feelings for Lucy. When we have a conflict arising because of these incompatible feelings or unreciprocated feelings, we are said to have affective conflict. Sometimes intercultural conflict happens when people disagree about what the best course of action might be. So people here might agree about where the end point of a situation ought to be, so they know where they want to end up, but they have differing ideas about how to get there. So we see one group wants to go over the wall, one group wants to go under the wall, and one group wants to go through the wall. When we experience a conflict like this, we're experiencing a conflict of interest. Intercultural conflict that occurs because people have different ideologies is called a value conflict. So if the couple in the photo fought over what their marriage ceremony would look like, they would be having a value conflict. They both have different religious ideologies, and we can tell that because in the photo there's two different officiates at the wedding. So they had to make a decision about what their ceremony would look like. How would they make their marriage ceremony their own? So if they fought about what that would look like, again, that would be a value conflict. Intercultural conflict also occurs because people perceive the world differently. As we've learned this semester, sometimes our cultural backgrounds enable us to see the same thing from completely different vantage points. So what looks like 4 to one individual might look like 3 to the other. And when we have conflicts of this nature, they're called cognitive conflicts. Finally, intercultural conflict happens when people have different ideas about which outcome is the most desirable. So for our honeymoon, I wanted to go to Hawaii and my husband wanted to go to Alaska. We were experiencing goal conflict because we each had a different idea about where we wanted to end up. We went to Alaska. As we examine intercultural conflict and try to understand why it's happening, we have to consider the reasons why conflict occurs as well as the context in which that conflict occurs. So relationships can be confusing at times because conflict is so contextual. What is acceptable for a relational partner in one context might not be in another context. So depending on the context, the same behaviors can either be acceptable or unacceptable. Likewise, the social context matters. So while polygamy might be acceptable to the individuals in TLC's sister wives, society doesn't see it as acceptable, and at times the Brown family has felt social pressures to move to new communities because their ideologies aren't acceptable to the other members of that neighborhood. So that's a value conflict that's occurring at the societal rather than a relational level. So there's lots of reasons why conflict can happen in intercultural relationships. Even when people share cultural ideas, there is always the potential for conflict. So you can imagine how coming from different cultural backgrounds might make intercultural relationships more prone to conflict than relationships between individuals who share more cultural ideologies.